Well, we're here, she said cheerfully. Don't bother about Eleanor. Maybe she has something on her mind. Spencer caught her arm almost wildly. Carol, do you think Howard is being unfaithful? He may have a pretty lady somewhere, Carol said, but Eleanor wouldn't mind, of course, unless it got out. This picture of modern marriage proving too much for her, Mrs. Spencer closed her eyes. I think I'll have some digitalis, she said faintly. Eleanor left the next day looking as though she had not slept, and piling her car with the numberless bags without which she never moved. She had not appeared at dinner the night before, sending word she still had a headache, and as she left shortly after lunch, her mother's grievance continued. Eleanor's plan, it appeared, was to drive herself to Providence, leave her car there, and take a train to New York. That leaves the limousine for you, she explained. You can use it all you like. Howard laid in plenty of gas. Mrs. Spencer said nothing, resentfully, but Eleanor did not notice. She talked on feverishly during lunch. Greg's citation, the probability of his marriage to Virginia Demarest before he went back, the dress for which she was to be fitted, and which was unlike her. She smoked fairly steadily through the meal. Carol was uneasy, and when Eleanor went upstairs for her coat and hat, she followed her. Eleanor was at the safe in her bedroom. She started somewhat. Money for the trip, she said lightly. What's the matter with you, Carol? You look ghastly. I thought you did, Carol said bluntly. Nonsense, I'm all right. See here, Carol, why not stay here for a while? Greg won't go to Maine. He has other things on his mind, and it only reminds you of things you'd better forget. I can manage, Carol said rather dryly. I can't change the plans now. It's too late. Let the servants go up alone. Lucy Norton will be there, won't she? There seemed a certain insistence in Eleanor's voice. I'm leaving Sunday, she said. It's too late to change. She watched Eleanor at her dressing table, laden with the gold toilet things, the jars and perfume bottles which were as much a part of her as her carefully darkened eyebrows. She was running a brush over the eyebrows now, but the line was not too even. Eleanor's hands were shaking. And that is the end of chapter 1. This is chapter 2 of The Yellow Room. The trip to Boston was a nightmare. The train was jammed with a Sunday crowd and stopped frequently with a jerk that almost broke her neck. It was still hot, and her mind was filled with the events of the past 3 days. Any attempt to locate Greg in Washington had met with failure, and Mrs. Spencer had taken refuge in her bedroom and dignified silence. Then on Sunday she had openly rebelled. I think I'll go with you, Carol, she said. I might as well. If all Eleanor provides me with is a place to sleep and food to eat, I see no reason for staying. It had taken Carol a half hour to persuade her to stay. June was often cold in Maine, and the house would be damp anyhow, she said. Also, the girls would have all they could do. Her mother would certainly be uncomfortable. Better to wait a few days. At least she was well housed and well fed where she was. And that crisis was barely over when she had a visit from Virginia Demarest. Virginia was a tall, slim, red-headed girl, very pretty and very young, and just now very indignant. "I wish you'd tell me where Greg is," she said. "Oh, don't you know either? I haven't heard from him since he left San Francisco for Washington the first of the week." She lit a cigarette and threw the match away almost violently. "We only know he's in this country, Virginia. We are opening Crestview for him. Not my idea," Carol added hastily, seeing Virginia's face. "Mother thinks he needs to be cool after where he's been. He's somewhere in Washington probably. He was to get his medal or whatever it is this week. Of course he's busy." "There are telephones in Washington," Virginia said stormily. All the phones in the country seem to have been sent there. Also, I presume they still sell 3-cent stamps. What does Eleanor say?" "She's in New York. She hasn't heard either." Virginia eyed her. "She and Greg are a pretty close corporation, aren't they?" Carol smiled. "I came along later," she said, "rather as an unpleasant surprise, I gather. Yes, they're very fond of each other." Virginia was not listening. She was looking at a photograph of Greg, tall and handsome in his flying clothes and helmet. His truculence had gone now. Her truculence had gone now. She put out her cigarette and glanced rather helplessly at Carol. "There's something wrong," she said. "Something's happened to him. Ever since he left after his last leave, his letters have been different. I suppose men can fall out of love as well as in." "That's ridiculous," Carol said with spirit. If ever I saw a man who had gone overboard completely, it was Greg. Of course his letters are different. They had to be read by a censor. You know that." But Virginia was not convinced. They have girls out there," she said. "Nurses, wax, all sorts. He may have found someone he likes. He's no child. He's 34 and he's been around. You know him." Carol knew him, she admitted to herself. She had always adored him. His good looks, his debonair manners, even the lightness with which he threw off his occasional lapses. It had been she, years ago, who had slipped to him the headache tablets or even the scotch, which braced him the morning after so that he could face the family. And she had understood him better than Eleanor. You'd better grow up soon," she had told him one morning, standing long-legged and gawky by his bed. He grinned at her. "Why?" he inquired. "God, what awful mess is this?" He took it grimacing. "It's fun to be young, Carol. Or it was last night." She roused herself when she reached Boston. She managed to get to the North Station in a taxi which threatened to break down at any moment, and she found there 3 tired and discouraged women servants who had no dinner and were standing by the bags they had carried themselves. Only Maggie the cook gave her a thin smile. "Well, we've got this far, Miss Carroll," she said, "and if you know where we can get a cup of coffee—" She got them fed after some difficulty, sitting with them at the table and trying to swallow a dry cheese sandwich. They cheered considerably after the food. There were no porters to be had. They lugged their bags to the train and got aboard. It had taken on the aspects of adventure to the 2 younger girls, especially since Carol was with them. But when she tried to enter her drawing room, the door was locked, and the porter said it was already occupied. It was useless to protest. If 2 tickets had been sold for the same room, you could blame the war, and anyone who protested was unpatriotic. She smoked a cigarette in the woman's room before she crawled resignedly into her lower berth. She supposed everything was all right. Eleanor would be at home by this time, and Virginia would have heard from Gregory.